All right, welcome to another deep dive. This time, we're going to be taking a look at willpower.
Excellent.
And
Yeah.
we're using the book Willpower, Rediscovering the Greatest Human Strength by Roy F. Baumeister and John Tierney.
Okay.
We've got excerpts from the audiobook. And yeah, I think our mission is to really try to figure out what this thing is, willpower,
Yeah,
and what are its limits and how can we make it work for us, you know?
absolutely.
One of the things that just jumped out at me right away was how the authors debunk this whole idea of unlimited willpower
Right.
right from the start, you know?
Yeah, it's such a pervasive misconception.
Yeah.
We tend to think about it as, like this well of strength that we can just constantly draw from.
Right.
But actually what the research shows is that it's much more like a finite resource,
Oh, okay.
like physical energy.
Yeah.
As we go about our day, making decisions, resisting temptations, all of that stuff, we're actually drawing from this limited pool.
Yeah, it's interesting because there are definitely times I feel like, man, I just am out of willpower right now.
Right.
You know, like later in the day, especially.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You're much more susceptible to those temptations later in the day.
Yeah, like ordering takeout instead of cooking dinner. You know what I mean?
Totally.
Is that kind of what they're talking about here?
Yeah, absolutely. And they actually call it willpower depletion.
Right.
And there's this one study that they talk about that's a really interesting example of this. It involves chronic dieters.
Oh, yeah. This is the one of the sad movie,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Terms of endearment.
Yes. So they had these dieters watch the really tearjerker scene from Terms of Endearment where, Deborah Winger's character is saying goodbye to her family.
Right.
And half of them were told to suppress their emotions, like hold back the tears.
Oh,
The
wow.
other half could just, react naturally,
Yeah.
cry if they want to.
Yeah. Gosh, I can only imagine how challenging that must be.
Oh, yeah.
To try to hold back, like, those genuine emotions.
Totally.
But what does this have to do with willpower and dieting?
Well, so afterwards, all of the participants got to rate different types of ice cream.
Okay.
And here's the fascinating part. The dieters who had suppressed their emotions during the movie, they ended up eating way more ice cream
Really?
than those who'd let themselves cry.
So even though the tasks were totally different, one's emotional regulation and one's, resisting a treat,
Right.
they both tapped into the same, like, willpower reserve,
Exacto.
which had already been depleted.
Exactly. So you use it up in one area, you're going to have less to use in another.
Yeah. It really suggests that willpower is not specific to certain activities. It's like a general resource that gets used up throughout the day.
Precisely.
And that has huge implications for, how we manage our energy and make decisions.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I mean, it really makes you realize that all those little decisions we make throughout the day and moments of resistance, they can really add up.
Right.
And they impact, our willpower later on.
Absolutely. Recognizing that can really help us make more conscious choices about when we engage in activities that require a lot of willpower
Yeah.
and when we need to prioritize rest and recovery.
Okay, so we've established that willpower is limited.
Right.
But like, what's actually happening in our brains when we're using it?
Yeah.
Is there a physiological explanation for this depletion effect?
There is.
Okay.
And it's a really fascinating one.
Okay.
The authors reveal this link between willpower and glucose.
Okay, so you're telling me that resisting that donut is actually draining my brain's energy supply.
That's a very simplified way of putting it. But yes, essentially, your brain needs glucose to function properly.
Yeah.
And acts of self-control actually draw upon this energy reserve.
Okay.
So in a sense, it's literally using up fuel.
So does that mean that I could, like, boost my willpower just by eating more sugar?
It's not quite that simple. While research has shown that maintaining stable glucose levels can definitely improve self-control, just loading up on sugar is not going to make you like a willpower machine.
Right.
It's more about, keeping your energy levels consistent.
Okay.
So maybe instead of reaching for a candy bar when you're feeling depleted, focus on eating those balanced meals throughout the day
Right.
to keep those energy levels stable.
Okay.
The comedian Jim Turner, actually, he has this great routine called Diabetes My Struggles With
Okay.
that uses humor to kind of talk about this idea of managing blood sugar
Yeah.
and how it impacts willpower.
Okay, I'll have to check that out. It's amazing how much, our physical well-being can influence something as seemingly mental as willpower.
Yeah.
The book also dives into how willpower develops in children.
Right.
And I thought their take on different parenting approaches was really
Right.
interesting. They contrast kind of two distinct styles. On the one hand, there's this everybody gets a trophy kind of method
Right.
where you're constantly praising kids and shielding them from any kind of failure.
Right. Avoiding any kind of discomfort.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And while that might sound positive on the surface, the book actually argues that it can, hinder the development of self-control.
Right, because they don't actually get to build resilience. They don't learn from mistakes.
Right.
And it's so crucial for the development of willpower.
Right. So then on the other hand, they talk about kind of the demanding standards that are often found in video games.
Interesting.
Yeah. And I can already hear parents like, video games, are you serious?
Right.
But I mean, I'm curious to hear their reasoning.
Well, video games, especially like these online role-playing games, they often require players to start from scratch and work their way up,
Right.
facing all these challenges and setbacks along the way.
Right. They die 1,000 virtual deaths before, they achieve mastery.
Exactly, but they're totally hooked.
Yeah.
And they'll spend hours honing their skills, persevering through these really difficult levels.
Yeah, and they're developing like focus, strategic thinking,
Totally.
even willpower without even realizing it.
And so the book is asking, can we harness those principles that make video games so engaging?
Yeah.
The challenge, the mastery, the reward system.
Yeah.
Can we apply those to real-life learning and goals to make them more motivating?
It makes you wonder, like, can we tap into that same level of dedication and perseverance outside the world of video games?
Absolutely.
And they also give the example of the Kim sisters, these, world-renowned violinists,
Okay.
as, another example of how a very strict, achievement-oriented upbringing can actually cultivate willpower.
Interesting.
Yeah, so their father basically dedicated their lives to musical excellence.
Wow.
And while that level of intensity might not be suitable for every child, it does kind of highlight the power of discipline and consistent effort.
Right.
And like a clear vision in developing self-control.
Absolutely. So it seems like kids are really capable of incredible focus and self-discipline when they're engaged.
Yeah.
And motivated.
So maybe the key is to find ways to make those real-life challenges feel as compelling
Right.
as those virtual worlds,
Absolutely. Now let's switch gears a little bit and talk about something that's likely to resonate with a lot of listeners.
Okay.
The challenges of dieting.
Okay. Yeah. I'm definitely interested in hearing more about this.
Yeah.
Dieting is something a lot of people struggle with. And I've definitely had my share of failed attempts.
Yeah.
So why are these traditional approaches so ineffective? What's going on there?
Well, they talk about this concept called the what the hell effect.
Oh, yeah.
And this describes the tendency to just abandon our healthy eating goals completely
Right.
after a single slip up. It's that feeling of, well, I already blew it today, so might as well just eat everything in sight.
Oh my gosh, yes, I know that feeling so well. Like one little indulgence and it just spirals out of control.
Totally. But why does this happen? Is it just a lack of willpower?
Yeah.
Well, what they argue is that it's often because of the restrictive nature of a lot of these diets.
Oh, yeah.
So when we're severely limiting calories, we can actually deplete our willpower even further,
Oh, wow.
making us more susceptible to temptation.
So it's like a self-defeating cycle,
Totally.
You restrict, you deplete your willpower,
Yeah.
you give in, you feel guilty,
Right.
and then it's even harder to get back on track.
Exactly. So instead of relying on sheer willpower to resist every craving, they suggest, focusing on those sustainable changes
Okay.
and strategies that actually conserve our willpower rather than constantly draining it.
Okay.
So instead of just white-knuckling it, try finding ways to kind of avoid those what the hell moments altogether.
So instead of like a restrictive diet, it's more about making those gradual changes and finding ways to manage, the temptation and not just like completely restricting yourself.
Totally.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So we've talked about willpower being limited, how it's linked to glucose, how it develops in children.
Right.
But what about those times when we seem to sabotage ourselves?
Yeah.
Like we know what we should do, but we just can't seem to make ourselves do it.
Right.
What's going on there?
Well, that brings us to this fascinating realm of self-sabotage.
Yeah.
And the book explores how unconscious cues and thought patterns can really undermine our best intentions.
Oh.
I know it's like we're working against ourselves without even realizing it.
Like, give me an example. What are some of these like sneaky ways that we sabotage ourselves?
Okay, well, one surprising one is the impact of hunger on decision making.
Really?
So studies have shown that people make poorer decisions when they're hungry. And they even found that judges, like, issue harsher rulings before lunch.
Oh, wow. Okay, that's really interesting.
Isn't that fascinating?
Yeah.
It just highlights how these seemingly unrelated factors can have a huge impact on our self-control
Right.
and our decision-making.
So maybe instead of trying to, like, power through important tasks when we're hungry or tired, we should schedule them for times when we have more mental energy.
Exactly. Work with your natural rhythms instead of against them.
Yeah.
That can be a really powerful strategy
Okay.
for boosting your willpower.
This is all really insightful stuff. I feel like we're starting to understand the complexities of willpower
Yeah.
and how it plays out in different areas of our lives.
Absolutely.
But we've only just scratched the surface.
We have.
So there's a lot more to explore, practical strategies for strengthening willpower and making it work for us.
Absolutely.
So we'll be back soon with part 2 of this deep dive.
Okay.
Where we'll continue to unpack all the secrets of willpower,
Sounds great.
and how to make it work for us.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah.
Right.
Welcome back to our deep dive into willpower. One of the things that really stuck with me from the last part was that idea of willpower being like a muscle.
Oh, yeah. It's a great analogy, And just like any muscle, you can strengthen it through exercise,
Right.
through training, but it's not about just constantly pushing yourself to the limit.
Right. Because we already know that it's a finite resource.
Exactly. You're not going to make a muscle stronger if you just constantly exhaust it.
Right.
You got to give it a chance to recover, to grow.
Okay, so how do we exercise our willpower without, like, completely exhausting it?
Right.
Because I remember they mentioned some studies about this.
Yeah, they did some really interesting research on this. And what they found was that engaging in specific activities that require self-control can actually help boost your willpower over time.
Oh, okay. So, like, what kind of activities are we talking about?
Well, in one study, they had participants use their non-dominant hand for everyday tasks. Oh, wow.
Like brushing their teeth or eating.
Okay.
And in another study, they had people focus on modifying their speech patterns, like avoiding certain words or phrases.
Okay, that sounds kind of quirky. But I'm guessing there's a method to the madness, right?
There is. It's about engaging those self-control muscles, so to speak, in a consistent way,
Okay.
in a deliberate way. So by practicing self-control in one area, you're kind of strengthening that underlying capacity,
Oh, okay.
which can then spill over into other areas of your life.
So, like, if I train myself to resist grabbing my coffee mug with my dominant hand, I might also find it easier to resist that piece of cake later on.
Exactly. It's like cross-training for your willpower.
Okay, I like that.
Yeah.
So what were the results? Like, did these exercises actually work?
They did. The results were pretty remarkable. They found that participants who engaged in these exercises, they actually showed improvements in other areas of self-control,
Really?
even ones that were unrelated to the specific task they practiced. That's really encouraging. So we can actually train ourselves to become more disciplined.
Yes. More resilient.
That's great news.
Now, these exercises are helpful,
Right.
but even more crucial for long-term success is building good habits.
Yeah, that makes sense. Because habits, by definition, are automatic, right?
Right.
So they don't require a lot of willpower to maintain. So if we can cultivate good habits, we're essentially freeing up our willpower for other things.
Exactly. It's like putting your willpower on autopilot.
Right. Okay, so that makes sense for building good habits. But what about breaking bad habits?
Right. Well, breaking bad habits often involves disrupting those automatic cues and routines.
Okay.
So one thing they suggest is changing your environment or your routine to kind of weaken that association between the trigger and the behavior.
So, like, if I have a habit of snacking while I'm watching TV,
Right.
try watching a different show.
Yeah, exactly. Or sit in a different chair.
Yeah, okay.
Even try a different activity altogether.
Right.
Anything to disrupt that ingrained pattern
Gotcha, yeah.
to make it easier to break free from the habit's grip.
Okay, that's helpful. Now, they also discuss this idea of positive procrastination, which sounds a little bit like an oxymoron.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it?
How can procrastination be positive?
Well, the idea is instead of trying to deny yourself a temptation completely, you simply postpone it.
Okay.
So instead of saying, I'm never eating chocolate again, you tell yourself, I'll have some later, just not right now.
Oh, okay. I can see how that would be less daunting than complete abstinence.
Yeah.
But, like, does it actually work?
Often it does. Because, by the time later arrives, the urge might have passed.
Right.
Or, you've regained enough willpower to enjoy the treat in moderation.
Okay.
It's about outsmarting your impulses rather than battling them head on.
Okay. I like that approach. So we've talked about habits, but they also talk a lot about the importance of monitoring our behavior.
Mm.
And I get how that works for things like spending or, calorie intake. But how do you monitor something like willpower, that's internal?
Right. Well, it's not about literally measuring willpower itself. It's more about tracking the specific behaviors you're trying to control.
Okay.
So let's say you're trying to reduce your screen time. Keep a log of how much time you're actually spending on your devices.
Right.
And the reason that's helpful is because, it kind of makes it harder to fool yourself about your progress.
Yeah, I can see that. Like if you have that concrete data, it's harder to just, sweep it under the rug.
Exactly, exactly. And there's a reason for that. Research has shown that people who monitor their behavior, they tend to be more successful in changing it.
Oh, wow. It's like that saying, what gets measured gets managed, right?
Exactly. And thankfully, we have all these tools now, these apps for tracking our spending, our fitness trackers, even apps that can monitor mood and sleep.
Right. It's like having a personal willpower coach, like right in your pocket.
Exactly.
But isn't there a risk of, becoming obsessed with the data?
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, it's all about balance.
Right.
Right. So use the tools strategically.
Yeah.
Don't let the data take over your life.
Right. Right. Use it as like a helpful guide, not a source of stress.
Exactly. Exactly. Now, speaking of, helping ourselves along the way, we've talked a lot about denial and self-control, but shouldn't there be some fun in this process?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, who wants to live a life of constant deprivation? That just sounds miserable.
Exactly. And the authors really emphasize this idea that self-control shouldn't be about punishment.
Right.
Right, about deprivation. It's important to acknowledge your progress and to reward yourself along the way.
Okay, so it's not about beating ourselves up for slip-ups, but it's about celebrating those small victories.
Exactly. Exactly. Even small rewards can make a big difference in reinforcing those positive behaviors.
I remember they gave the example of those electric toothbrushes that, display a smiley face after 2 minutes of brushing.
Oh, yeah.
It seems silly.
It's the little things.
Yeah, yeah. But I bet it works.
It totally is. And that's the point,
Yeah.
Find what motivates you, whether it's a visual cue, a small treat, whatever it is.
Right.
Use it to fuel your willpower journey.
Okay, so this brings us to kind of a fundamental question. Can willpower actually be strengthened? Is it something we're born with, or can we actually get better at it over time?
Well, the book presents pretty compelling evidence that willpower is not fixed.
Okay.
It's a skill that can be learned and strengthened through practice.
That's huge. I mean, that's so empowering
It is.
because it means we're not, stuck with whatever level of willpower we happen to be born with.
Right.
We can actually take steps to improve it.
Exactly. It's a message of hope and agency.
I like that.
And speaking of agency, one powerful strategy for boosting willpower is what they call pre-commitment.
Pre-commitment. Okay, that sounds interesting.
Yeah.
What is that?
So it's essentially about making choices in advance when your willpower is strong. That will kind of set you up for success later on when temptation is high. So, for example, if you know that you tend to overspend when you're tired or stressed, you could pre-commit by setting a budget. Right. Or limiting your access to credit cards.
Right.
Or if you're trying to eat healthier, you could pre-commit by meal prepping on the weekends.
Right.
Ordering groceries online, to avoid those impulse purchases at the store.
Right. So you're basically taking the decision-making out of the equation when your willpower is likely to be low.
Exactly, exactly. And it works. There was one study that found that people who made a pre-commitment to exercise, they were way more likely to actually stick with their routine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
You're removing the opportunity to, sabotage yourself.
Exactly. Now, before we move on, I want to touch on something they call the planning fallacy, which I know I'm personally guilty of.
Oh, yeah. The planning fallacy.
So they talk about how we tend to underestimate how long it will take us to complete tasks or achieve goals.
We're all guilty of that.
Oh, yeah. We're overly optimistic in our planning.
Which can lead to, frustration and overwhelm.
Totally.
Oh, yeah. Tell me about it. I always overestimate how much I can get done in a day, and then I just feel stressed and defeated.
Right. Well, they highlight this study where they asked college students who were working on their thesis papers to predict when they would finish.
Okay.
And even when they asked them for a best case and a worst case scenario, they were still wildly off.
Right.
Most of them took way longer than they anticipated.
So how do we avoid this trap? How can we become more realistic in our planning?
Well, one thing they suggest is breaking down large goals into smaller, more manageable steps.
Okay.
This makes the task feel less daunting and it allows you to celebrate those smaller wins along the way.
Okay, yeah. So instead of like focusing on writing an entire book, I should start by outlining one chapter.
Exactly. Exactly. And don't forget about those basic needs, that can really impact willpower.
Right, like getting enough sleep.
Sleep, diet, and even neatness.
Right, neatness. Are you telling me a messy desk can drain my willpower?
It's true. Believe it or not, studies have shown that people actually exert less self-control after being exposed to a messy
Oh,
environment
wow, that's fascinating.
compared to a clean one.
That makes sense, though,
Yeah,
because clutter can be so distracting and overwhelming.
exactly.
It's like, yeah, I could see how that would deplete my mental energy.
Absolutely. So taking a few minutes to tidy up your workspace might actually give you a willpower boost.
Okay, well, that's good to know. Now, before we wrap up this part, I think it's important to acknowledge that, we're all human,
Absolutely.
and we're going to have moments when our willpower falters.
Right. Of course. We all have those moments of weakness.
So what do we do when we inevitably slip up?
The key is to approach those setbacks with self-compassion rather than self-criticism,
Okay.
because beating yourself up for mistakes just depletes your willpower further,
Right.
and it makes it harder to get back on track.
Okay, so it's about recognizing those setbacks are inevitable, treating ourselves with kindness, and then focusing on getting back on track.
Exactly. It's about progress, not perfection. Remember, willpower is a skill, and like any skill, it takes practice.
All right, welcome back to our deep dive into willpower. So we've covered a lot of ground already, talking about it being a finite resource, the importance of building those good habits, even that surprising connection to like neatness and how that can impact our willpower.
It really is fascinating how many different facets of willpower there are to explore.
Right.
And in this final part, I'd love to dive into an aspect we haven't really touched on yet, the social dimension of willpower.
Okay, the social dimension. So you mean like how hanging out with friends who have zero willpower can totally sabotage your own efforts?
Well, that's definitely part of it, but the book goes beyond, just simple peer pressure.
Okay.
It actually explores how our social connections can actually boost our willpower in some really surprising ways.
Okay, so it's not all bad news when it comes to like willpower and social influence.
No, not at all.
Tell me more about this, like social willpower boost. What's going on there?
So one thing they highlight is research showing that self-control can actually be contagious.
Oh, wow. Contagious.
Yeah. For example, there have been studies that found that when one person quits smoking, it actually increases the likelihood that their friends and family members will quit too.
Interesting. So it's like willpower becomes kind of like a shared social norm within a group.
Exactly. It's like seeing someone close to us successfully exert self-control can inspire us to do the same. And it goes beyond just, individual behaviors too. The book talks about how connecting to something larger than ourselves, whether it's a religious faith, a cause we believe in, a community, can actually provide a really powerful source of willpower.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like having that sense of purpose, that sense of belonging can definitely fuel our motivation, gives us a sense of accountability. Did they give any specific examples of this?
Yeah, they mentioned microloan programs in developing countries as an example.
Okay.
Those often rely on group lending, where a small group of people is collectively responsible for repaying the loan.
Oh, okay. And so this shared responsibility helps keep everyone on track.
Exactly. So it's like the social pressure and the support from the group, helps individuals stay committed to their financial goals. It's like they're tapping into this like collective willpower reserve.
Interesting. So surrounding yourself with people who have strong willpower or joining groups that share your goals, that can actually make it easier to achieve your own goals.
Absolutely. It's about leveraging that power of social influence to our advantage.
I like that. Now, speaking of social influence, I want to kind of shift gears a little bit and talk about the implications of willpower for parenting.
Oh, perfect segue.
Because parents are constantly trying to instill self-control in their kids.
Right. It's like their full-time job.
Right, exactly. So what insights does the book offer on this front? Like, how can parents help their kids develop stronger willpower?
Well, one thing they emphasize is consistency. Having those clear expectations is so crucial. Children really thrive on structure and predictability.
So it's not about being like a drill sergeant, but it's about having those clear boundaries and
Yeah.
consequences.
Exactly. And they also highlight the importance of modeling good self-control ourselves.
Oh, yeah, because kids learn by watching us, right?
Absolutely. So if you're constantly giving in to your own impulses, your kids are going to pick up on that.
Right. So it's not enough to just talk about willpower. You have to actually embody it,
Yeah.
right?
Walk the walk.
Right. And when it comes to encouraging positive behaviors, do they suggest like focusing on rewards rather than punishment?
Exactly. Celebrating those small wins can be way more motivating than constantly reprimanding for missteps.
Right. Now, what about that classic marshmallow experiment? The one where kids had to choose between one marshmallow now or two
Oh,
later.
yeah, that's a classic. And what's really interesting is that the kids who could delay gratification, they actually ended up having more success later in life.
It's amazing how predictive that one little test was, right?
Right. So it's important to help children understand that, resisting those immediate impulses can sometimes lead to bigger rewards down the road. And they also suggest involving kids in the rule-making process.
Oh, that's a good idea.
So when children feel like they have a voice and agency, they're more likely to buy into the rules.
Right. It's about empowering them to make those conscious choices, not just blindly following orders.
Exactly.
Now, as we wrap up this deep dive, I think it's important to acknowledge that willpower isn't just about personal achievement.
Right.
It also has implications for, like, society as a whole, right?
Absolutely.
Like, think about all the challenges we're facing: climate change, political polarization, economic inequality. I mean, don't we need some kind of collective willpower to tackle these huge issues?
We absolutely do. And the book actually highlights how societies with higher levels of self-control tend to be more prosperous, they tend to be healthier, they tend to have less crime.
No.
It's really about creating a more just and sustainable world.
So it's not just about individual well-being. It's about contributing to a better future for everyone.
Absolutely. And the authors leave us with this really hopeful message. They say that willpower is a renewable resource. And the more we use it, the stronger it becomes, not just for ourselves, but for those around us.
Yeah, it's really inspiring to think about, cultivating our own willpower isn't just about self-improvement. It's about contributing to this, like, more positive and resilient society.
Exactly. By strengthening our own willpower, we can inspire others and create this ripple effect of positive change.
Well, this has been such a fascinating exploration of willpower. I feel like I have a whole new understanding of this really essential human capacity and how to actually harness its power.
Me too. It's been a pleasure diving into this with you. And to our listeners, remember, willpower is a journey. It's a journey of self-discovery, growth, and connection.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And, even those small acts of self-control, they can have a ripple effect.
Easily.
They can inspire others and create real change.
Keep diving, everyone.
Yeah, keep diving. Explore the power of willpower in your own lives and see what incredible things you can achieve.